standing just a few steps away from President Trump, I could feel the biting cold wind cutting through the bustling streets of Brooklyn Heights. Even through my thick coat, the chill seeped into my skin. Trump, wrapped in a dark overcoat, walked purposefully through the hurried crowd. I didn't understand why he chose to walk in this bitter cold instead of riding in the warmth of his usual motorcade. Yet his eyes seemed to scan the streets with an intensity, as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. As we turned into a narrow alley, I saw him stop abruptly. Following his gaze, I noticed a woman huddled against the cold stone wall. She was wrapped in a tattered military coat, its faded green blending almost seamlessly into the background. Beside her lay a cardboard sign scrawled with shaky handwriting, "Veteran in need of help." I hesitated to move closer, but I could see the change in Trump's expression. His brow furrowed, and his sharp gaze softened slightly. He gestured for us, his security detail, to step back. I heard the deliberate crunch of his footsteps against the salt-strewn pavement as he approached her. The woman lifted her head as Trump drew near. Her eyes, sunken and weary, still held a quiet dignity that was hard to describe. She shifted her posture, sitting a little straighter, as though summoning every ounce of pride she had left. Her voice was hoarse as she spoke. "Who are you?" I stood frozen, watching as Trump didn't answer immediately, but crouched down to her level. He extended his hand, steady and deliberate. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight that made each word resonate. The woman regarded him warily, her eyes scanning his face for any hint of insincerity. I noticed her calloused hands tremble slightly. Finally, she extended her hand, meeting his in a slow but firm handshake. She rose to her feet, her posture bent from years of hardship. "Emily Carter," she said, her voice raspy but clear, former Marine. I couldn't look away from that moment. Emily wasn't just stating her name, she was unearthing a history filled with pain and pride. And in that instant, I knew this wasn't a random encounter. It was the start of something far greater. Standing just a few steps behind, I watched silently as Trump spoke with Emily in the alley. When he repeated her name, Emily, I could tell he was committing it to memory, engraving it deeply. His voice, warm yet resolute, cut through the chilly air. "Emily, you look like someone who's been through a lot." Emily let out a dry, hollow laugh that was carried away by the cold wind. "More than I'd care to remember, sir, but everyone has their own cross to bear." Trump didn't reply immediately. His eyes fell to the faded medals pinned to her worn-out coat. After a moment of silence, he asked, his voice measured but heavy with meaning. "You're a veteran?" Emily nodded. Though she tried to hide it, a flicker of pride shone in her eyes. "Afghanistan, a few tours. We did things that haunt me, but we did them for our country." The silence that followed was palpable, broken only by the whistle of the wind echoing through the alley and the faint sound of distant traffic. Trump stood still, his gaze weighed with thought. After a pause, he asked, his voice low but filled with urgency, "Why are you here, Emily?" Emily lowered her head, her gloved hands clenched tightly as if trying to contain her pain. "I lost my way after I came back. It's hard to hold on to a job. My health fell apart, and the system, it doesn't work the way you think it will. Not until you find yourself on the outside." I caught a glimpse of Trump's nod, his expression contemplative. His eyes seemed to pierce an invisible barrier between him and Emily. He asked steadily, "What unit were you in?" Her response was clear, but carried the weight of her past. "Bravo Company, sir, 2nd Battalion. We were in Kandahar, back in the early days." I saw Trump pause, his eyes widening slightly. "Bravo Company," he repeated, almost incredulous. "You were part of the team that achieved the impossible. They called you the Phantom Squad." Hearing that, Emily's posture straightened instinctively, as if remembering a long-buried pride. A brief flicker of honor crossed her face before the reality of her present pulled her back. "Yes, we were good," she admitted, her voice softening. "But everything fell apart when we returned." For a moment they both stood there, the winter wind swirling around them, carrying faint echoes of the city. Trump looked at Emily intently, his eyes unwavering, and then spoke, his voice firm and resolute. "Come with me, Emily. You don't belong here." Emily lifted her gaze, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. But when she met Trump's steady, earnest look, she saw something genuine, a promise without pretense. Her pride made her hesitate, but at last she nodded. Emily looked up, a flicker of astonishment in her eyes. I couldn't tell what she was thinking, but when her gaze met Trump's, I saw something shift. It was as if his silent invitation needed no explanation, no conditions attached. Emily hesitated, her pride compelling her to refuse, but finally she gave a slight nod. I had been tasked with assisting in the arrangements for this meeting, but I never imagined it would turn into something so meaningful, so profound. A few days later, after Emily had been accommodated in a quiet hotel where President Trump ensured her privacy, I saw them sitting together in a corner of the hotel room one morning. The pale sunlight streamed through heavy curtains, and the warmth from their coffee cups seemed to melt away the lingering chill of winter. Trump leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. His voice, steady yet filled with conviction, reached Bunfor. My ears clearly, Emily. I want to do something for you. Not just a room or a few meals. I want people to know about Bravo Company, about what you've done so they can understand your sacrifices. I watched as Emily lowered her head, her rough hands clutching the coffee cup as though seeking solace. The steam rose to her face, but it couldn't erase the weight in her eyes. Her voice, raspy yet firm, broke the silence. I don't know, sir. Most of those memories should stay where they belong. Nobody wants to hear about the things we've done. Trump was silent for a moment. I could feel the stillness in the room, the air seemingly thickened by unspoken thoughts. His gaze remained fixed on Emily before he gently shook his head and replied, each word carefully chosen, not just for them, but for you. You walked into danger so we could live in peace. That courage cannot be buried. Emily slowly lifted her eyes, their initial haze giving way to clarity. I saw her searching his face, as if trying to discern the truth in his words. A heavy pause lingered between them before she sighed and nodded. Lightly. She said nothing more, but her silent acceptance spoke volumes. In the days that followed, I witnessed Trump's team quietly preparing for a special event. Calls were made to contact Emily's former unit members. Some were surprised, others deeply moved, but all agreed to attend, bringing their own stories and scars, both visible and invisible. On the day of the ceremony, I stood in the White House grounds as Emily arrived. I noticed her slow her steps, her eyes scanning the scene as if struggling to believe what was unfolding. Her simple suit framed her thin frame, and each step she took seemed to carry the weight of anticipation. I could sense her hesitation in the way her hands clenched tightly. Trump waited at the entrance. When Emily approached, his eyes softened, a hint of relief crossing his face. He didn't say anything, only nodded, a gesture filled with respect. I watched as Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself before following him inside. The room was solemn and dignified. Rows of chairs were perfectly aligned, and the glow of grand chandeliers cast an air of warmth over the space. As Emily entered, her shoulders tensed slightly. I heard the faint scrape of chairs as her former comrades rose to their feet. They saluted her in unison, some with tears glistening in their eyes, while others maintained a stoic demeanor laced with unspoken emotion. Standing in a corner of the room, I felt the atmosphere shift as President Trump took the stage. He gripped the podium firmly, as if anchoring himself to deliver the weight of his words. His voice, resonant and commanding, filled the space. Today, we honor an extraordinary individual, Emily Carter, and the entire Bravo Company. They achieved the unimaginable to protect us. Their sacrifices deserve recognition, not just for the battles they faced, but for the resilience they've shown against wounds no one can see. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the quiet, restrained breaths of those listening intently. Trump continued, his voice slowing, each word piercing the hearts of those present. Heroes come in many forms, but those who not only fight on the battlefield, but also endure storms within their own souls are truly deserving of that title. Trump gestured toward Emily, inviting her to join him on stage. I watched as she rose slowly, her emotions almost palpable in her movements. Each step seemed heavier, as if laden with the unspeakable weight of her journey. When she reached the center of the stage, applause erupted throughout the room, thunderous and unending. I noticed some veterans standing to salute her, while others bowed their heads in reverence. Emily stood still, her breathing unsteady, but her eyes gleamed with pride and unyielding strength. I watched as President Trump opened the velvet box and revealed a gleaming medal. intricately crafted with precision and care. Though the medal appeared small, I understood the immense weight of gratitude it carried. Trump approached Emily with steady, reverent hands, lifting the medal over her neck. His voice resonated deeply, slow and deliberate, each word etched into the room. "Emily, for your service, your courage, and your sacrifice, we honor you. You are a hero, not just to me but to everyone here." I noticed Emily standing still, not responding immediately. Her body seemed frozen, yet her eyes burned with emotion. Her rough hands clenched together, as if holding something back from overflowing. Gradually, tears welled up in her eyes. The hardened lines of her weathered face softened, revealing a profound gratitude that she had kept hidden for so long. Her chest heaved slightly, as if drawing in every bit of air to steady herself in this overwhelming moment. Trump stood tall, his gaze sweeping across the room. Clearing his throat, his focus shifted from Emily to the audience. Today is not just a celebration. It marks the beginning of a greater commitment, one that ensures veterans like Emily will never feel alone, abandoned, or forgotten again. I felt the atmosphere in the room shift. Every eye was fixed on the president, hanging on his every word. Trump outlined a comprehensive initiative, including healthcare support, job placement, and housing for veterans. He announced the establishment of a fund named the Bravo Company Foundation, a tribute to those who had silently sacrificed for the nation. Glancing around the room, I saw faces filled with emotion, some with tears shimmering in their eyes. In that moment, I realized Trump's words weren't just for Emily. They were for all veterans who deserved recognition and honor. As the ceremony continued, I stood at the back of the room, quietly observing. The silence was profound, so much so that I could hear the subdued breaths of those present. A few heads bowed, their eyes glistening with unspoken emotions. Standing beside President Trump, Emily closed her eyes briefly, exhaling a shaky breath as though the cracks in her soul were slowly being mended. When the ceremony concluded, the applause seemed endless. I watched as other veterans approached Emily, shaking her hand, some patting her shoulder, while others offered respectful military salutes. Emily didn't speak much, only nodding quietly and gripping their hands firmly. Her eyes conveyed an appreciation that needed no words. It was palpable, undeniable. In the weeks following the ceremony, I learned that Emily's life had taken a remarkable turn. She began attending events, sharing her story as a representative for veterans. I still remember the first time I saw her on stage. The spotlight seemed to make her slightly uneasy. I noticed her gripping the edge of the podium, her gaze briefly scanning the audience as if seeking an anchor before she began. But when her warm, steady voice filled the room, I immediately recognized the sincerity in every word she spoke. The audience sat spellbound, listening as she recounted stories of camaraderie, harrowing battles, and the invisible wounds she and her comrades carried home. Over time, I witnessed Emily transform. Her confidence grew with every speech. Each time she stepped onto a stage, she spoke not just for herself, but for thousands of veterans still fighting shadows in their hearts. Her voice, though slightly hoarse, carried a warmth and power that inspired all who heard her. One day, I heard Emily had been invited to speak at the National Veterans Honor Gala. I was there when she opened the envelope, her hands trembling slightly as she read the invitation. It was the largest event she had ever been asked to attend, and when she realized President Trump would also be present, a flicker of anxiety crossed her face. But in mere moments, Emily took a deep breath and nodded to herself, affirming that she was ready. On the night of the gala, I stood near the entrance, watching as Emily walked in. The shimmering chandeliers bathed the room in elegance and grandeur. Her tailored black suit added an air of dignity to her presence. I could see the weight in every step she took, not just from the gravity of the event, but from the responsibility she carried. Eyes turned to her, some recognizing her from articles, others intrigued by the story behind this extraordinary veteran. Transcribed. As Emily stepped onto the stage, I noticed her pace slow slightly. I could almost hear the pounding of her heartbeat, synchronized with the bright stage lights glaring into her eyes, making everything ahead seem blurred. She gripped the edge of the podium gently, her head bowing slightly as if to regain balance. From the front row, I saw President Trump smile and nod encouragingly. That single gesture was like an invisible thread, grounding Emily and restoring her confidence to begin her speech. I stood silently nearby, deeply aware of the power in what Emily was about to share and how profoundly her story would resonate. Standing at the edge of the stage, just below her, I watched as Emily paused at the podium, drawing in a deep breath. Her shoulders rose and then lowered gradually. When she spoke, her voice was warm, though a slight tremor lingered in her opening words. Today, I stand before you not as a hero, but as someone who once almost lost herself. I saw Emily lift her head, her eyes scanning the room, radiating a determination that was almost palpable. I returned from the battlefield, thinking I had won the war, only to realize the battle was far from over. It had just begun. Wars don't end when the guns fall silent. They persist in the quiet moments, in the loneliness, and in the struggle to rediscover purpose. The room fell utterly silent, not a single sound breaking the stillness. Every eye was fixed on Emily, as if drawn to her every word. I saw her swallow hard, her hand tightening slightly around the edge of the podium. But when she continued, her voice gained strength and clarity. For years I wandered as a stranger in my own country, invisible and forgotten. I was ready to give up, to disappear into the shadows of this city. But then, one day, someone stopped and truly saw me, not as a stranger, but as a human being. Emily paused, taking a deep breath, visibly holding back a swell of emotion. Her hands released their grip on the podium as her gaze swept across the audience before settling on the front row. That person was President Trump, and because of him I stand here today, not as a lost soldier, but as a proud veteran with a renewed sense of purpose. I couldn't help but glance at Trump. He sat there, nodding gently, his eyes glistening with emotion, his face a mixture of pride and humility. Emily paused briefly, her hands falling by her sides. I noticed them trembling slightly. Then she lifted her head high, her voice firm, imbued with newfound strength. "But tonight isn't just about me," Emily declared, each word resonating with power and clarity. "Tonight is about the countless men and women who have given everything for this country, only to return and face another battle. It's about the families who have stood by them, the communities that need to welcome them, and a nation that must remember them. I am here as a reminder that no veteran should ever feel forgotten." The applause thundered through the room, catching me off guard. Many people rose to their feet. I noticed some placing a hand gently over their hearts, while others couldn't hold back tears that streamed down their faces. As Emily descended the stage, I saw her shoulders gradually relax. Her eyes met with admiring, respectful gazes from all corners of the room. President Trump rose and stepped onto the stage. Placing a hand on Emily's shoulder, he offered a gesture of quiet support. His voice rang out, clear yet filled with emotion. Emily's story is one of incredible strength. It reminds all of us of our responsibility to those who have protected us. He paused briefly, his gaze sweeping the room before continuing, each word deliberate. Resonating deeply with everyone present, today I am announcing a new commitment, the creation of the Veterans Assistance Fund, led by Emily herself. This fund will provide our veterans with the resources they need, not just to survive, but to thrive, from housing and mental health support to career training. No veteran will ever be left behind. I stood at the back of the room as President Trump announced the establishment of the support fund. The room buzzed with excited murmurs and applause echoed endlessly. Yet all eyes were on Emily. She stood there, her expression a mix of astonishment and profound gratitude that words could hardly capture. In that moment, Emily was no longer just a veteran, she had become a symbol of hope and renewal. As the ceremony concluded, I quietly watched as people approached Emily to shake her hand. Some clasped her hand firmly, their eyes brimming with respect. Each handshake, each word of gratitude seemed to soothe the wounds Emily had carried for so many years. After the ceremony, I learned that Emily had taken on the role of leading the support fund. She frequently visited veteran centers, shaking hands with each individual. I had seen the resolve in her eyes as she listened intently to their stories. Whenever Emily stood before a crowd, she gripped the microphone tightly, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice was always warm and resolute. Her words pierced through the layers of indifference, reaching straight into the hearts of her listeners. When Emily returned home after each day, I often noticed her standing before the mirror. Her eyes, tired and shadowed from exhaustion, no longer held the emptiness of her lonely years. Instead, they reflected a quiet sense of fulfillment. The support fund Emily led became more than just a charitable organization. Veterans who came to the fund didn't merely seek assistance, they rediscovered themselves. I witnessed the light returning to one's dimmed eyes, hands that had been clenched and worry now outstretched to grasp new opportunities. Under Emily's leadership, the fund became a movement, a beacon of hope and acknowledgement that those who had dedicated their lives to their country deserved far more than a simple handshake. I recall speaking with Emily about that fateful moment in the narrow alley years ago. She told me that every time she thought of it, she felt a cold gust sweep through her chest. The image of President Trump reaching out his hand, his warm gaze piercing the freezing air, remained etched in her memory. Emily said that moment had changed everything, not just for her, but for hundreds of other veterans. It hadn't just saved her life, it had ignited in her a profound sense of purpose. As for President Trump, I occasionally saw him quietly attending the fund's events. He would sit in the back row, his gaze fixed on Emily. Trump seldom spoke at these gatherings, but the faint, satisfied smile on his lips told me everything. In those moments, I believed he realized that the hand he extended that day had sparked a legacy far greater than he could have imagined. Over time, I watched Emily become a guiding light for other lost veterans. She traveled far and wide, meeting them one by one and witnessing lives transformed. I believe the light from her story not only illuminates the present but also reaches into the future, inspiring generations to honor those who have devoted their lives to their country with the respect and gratitude they so deeply deserve. How do you think compassion and appreciation can help heal profound wounds? Share your thoughts. Sometimes, small idea is enough to ignite a great flame of change. If you enjoy inspiring and compelling stories, please support us by subscribing to our channel, liking, sharing, and commenting below. Wishing you a wonderful and peaceful day.